Going in the woods alone sounds spooky to most, but to Jane Marie Prichard, that was a regular thing. Jane was a botanist who loved the outdoors and alone time. One morning, while working on her thesis out in the wilderness, something awful happened, leaving her lifeless and undressed on the ground with several bullet wounds. On a Saturday in September of 1986, a couple went on a camping trip to the Blackbird State Forest in Delaware. After setting up their tent, they went out for a stroll to check out their new digs. While on their walk, the couple took in the beautiful sights, but then the mood abruptly shifted when they saw a woman's body about 20 feet off the trail. She was partially clothed and had a bullet wound on the back of her head. The camping couple immediately notified the police, who arrived as soon as they could. Officers began investigating, where they had trouble finding any evidence or leads. The only thing they could find was a single strand of hair. The woman was later identified as 28-year-old Jane Marie Prichard. She was a biology student at the University of Maryland, where she was working to get her master's degree. That day, she went to the Blackbird State Forest to conduct botany experiments for her thesis on the wild hog peanut, which I just learned is a plant, not an animal. So confusing. The hog peanut, or ground bean, is a native vine plant with edible seeds both above and below ground. For the past 3 years, Jane had been studying this plant, and it was a part of her thesis project. The leaves on the hog peanut vine pivot towards the sun, and Jane would set up electrical equipment to measure the movement. She just needed to collect the last bit of data to complete her presentation, and within a few months, she would get her degree, or at least that was the goal. On the morning of September 20th, 1986, Jane drove 115 miles in her blue and white 1980 Chevy Blazer, which was loaded up with her equipment. She arrived right around 7 a.m. and parked along an access road where she got her equipment out and started setting it up. The gear spanned from the edge of her car to about 90 feet into the woods. Jane was collecting information, but right before 10 a.m., her minute-by-minute recording came to a halt. That's also around the time she was last seen. So a few days after the incident, a squirrel hunter called the police to tell them he saw Jane that day and may have a lead for them. The man said he saw Jane talking to another hunter right around 10 a.m. He gave officials a description of the man he saw with her, and a sketch was drawn up and released to the press. Since it was the opening day of squirrel hunting season, there were quite a few people out there that day. Police believe there were around 25 to 50 hunters dispersed throughout the 7,000 acres of land at the park during the incident. The idea was thrown out there that Jane could have been fired at accidentally. Maybe a hunter was so in the zone that he didn't see the woman in the woods. But that theory was quickly nixed because Jane's clothes had been taken off. This was definitely an intentional act, a crime of opportunity. In Jane's autopsy, medical examiners determined the bullet wounds seemed deliberate too. Officers sectioned off the area where Jane was conducting her research. They searched it for days on end with metal detectors and screens to sift through the soil, just looking for any clues to go off of. A few pieces of evidence were sent to the FBI in Washington, but what those exact items are remains unknown to the public. Technicians from the chemical company DuPont even conducted a thorough analysis of the bullets that hit Jane. No leads came from that. Investigators interviewed around 300 people to try and gather any more information about what went down that fateful day. But the only real person with information was that one squirrel hunter who saw her that morning. Officers interviewed him a few more times after the sketch was released. One time, he went to the crime scene with police to reenact where he was and what he saw. The investigators then called him every day for a week, and each time they talked to this guy, his story would change a bit. With the inconsistencies in his statements, detectives started to think maybe the hunter was the perp they were looking for. Oh, interesting. That's pretty clever, honestly, for the guy to come forward as a witness to try and cover up his guilt. So the squirrel hunter's name is Michael P. Lloyd. At the time, he was in his late 20s and lived in Newark, where he worked as a janitor at a pharmaceutical company. He said he came forward with the information about Jane because he felt it was his civic duty, but instead, he was pinned for the crime. Michael was constantly hounded by the cops, and at one point, they asked if his brain possibly suppressed something he didn't want to remember. He said that was the only way it could have happened, but reassured them I know consciously I did not do it. Is that a confession? It kind of seems like one to me. After that, Michael was arrested by the cops and charged with first-degree slaughter and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. He was held without bail. Yo, that's crazy. I wonder if he really did do it, or if the police were just being slick with their words to get him to say that. So even though the detectives were sure Michael was their guy, they thought it would be smart to double-check their belief using DNA evidence, which was brand new to the crime world in the 80s. They obtained a search warrant for Michael's house to look for any additional evidence and obtain a hair sample to test against the one they found at the scene. The samples were sent out to California, which was home to the only DNA testing lab in the country at the time. Well, the samples were tested against one another. The results? Michael was not a match. Yep, the cops were absolutely certain Michael was the perp, but the evidence seemed to say otherwise. In August of 1987, the charges were dropped. Michael was released from prison, and it was back to square one for the detectives on Jane's case. You know, this story is making me nervous to come forward as a witness. Here Michael was trying to do a good thing, and then he got put in jail for it? I wonder what would have happened if they never tested the hairs. The prosecutor believed it was his duty to do justice and stated that with this finding of the expert, justice requires the state not to proceed with insufficient evidence. Needless to say, I am very disappointed. Jane's family was shocked to hear the news, but they obviously didn't want an innocent man to be punished for a crime he didn't commit. They just wanted the real perp to be found and convicted. Poor Michael was relieved to be let out, but was just pissed about the whole situation in general. He said his time in jail was the most degrading and humiliating experience of his life. When he was arrested, Michael said he lost everything: his job, apartment, reputation, and dignity. Michael will forever be haunted by the memories of being in prison for something he didn't do. And he'll especially remember the 4-day period when there was no running water or working toilets. Gosh, I can't even imagine what it must feel like to be accused like that, and what it must have smelled like when the toilets didn't work. Ew. With their only suspect cleared, investigators were back to the beginning with the suspect list. They reviewed the case details, but with the lack of evidence and other witnesses, Jane's case was moved to the cold case files, and detectives went on to investigate other newer cases. Years and years passed with no movement in the case, but in October of 2014, the New Castle County Police announced that they'd be creating a new cold case homicide squad to look back at old unsolved cases and try and find justice for the victims with the use of new technology. In the chief's words, a seasoned investigator with a fresh set of eyes and the use of modern technology may be able to help solve these heinous crimes and bring some closure to the families of the victim. Amen to that. So the chief, Elmer, actually reached out to a retired detective named Glenn, who first trained him when he got out of the academy. Elmer asked Glenn if he wanted to be a part of the new cold case unit. Anyway, when he was approached by the chief, Glenn was actually on his second attempt of being retired, but he couldn't handle his restlessness and said yes. He was then partnered up with another detective named Thomas, and the two got to work on Jane's case. They dusted off the old cardboard boxes in the evidence room and started sifting through it all. In their search, the duo determined that there was a lot of evidence that could produce DNA to hopefully test. Thomas told a news outlet, "We're expecting results any day." After reopening the case, detectives reached out to the Prichard family to let them know what was going on. They were happy to hear the authorities haven't given up on Jane, but are still fearful that they won't receive closure about what happened. Jane's brother, Keith, said hearing from the investigators was pretty tough because Jane's passing has left the whole family with emotional wounds that have yet to be healed. When authorities first reached out to the family, Jane's other brother, Greg, was skeptical of the whole thing. He heard about all these scams where people were targeting the families of victims from 9/11 and thought the phone call was a setup. Greg is also concerned that the reopening of Jane's case is going to get everyone's hopes up, but at the end of the day, he's interested to see what new information officials are able to find and wishes to get more answers answers about his sister. But the case was reopened back in 2015, and there still haven't been any announcements about hits, suspects, or advances in the case, at least to public knowledge. What happened to "we're expecting results any day"? Don't you mean year? Since things are at a standstill with the case, let's go back and see what kind of person Jane was and who she was involved with to come up with some theories. Jane grew up near Barnesville, Maryland, on a 38-acre farm with 3 siblings, 2 older brothers, Keith and Greg, and 1 younger sister named Beth. Out of them all, Jane was closest with her bro, Keith. Since she was a child, Jane loved everything about the outdoors, especially plants and horses. Jane's mom, Audrey, said Jane was always interested in plants and always growing something. Audrey even said Jane would make the whole family all sit around the table while she presented her findings on whatever plant she was studying. Overall, Jane was described as independent, adventurous, and driven. She graduated high school in 1976 as valedictorian and went to Western Maryland College, where she got her bachelor's degree in biology and political science. She graduated in 1980 with honors, of course. After obtaining her bachelor's degree, Jane got a job at the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission as a gardener. She moved into a small cottage in Clarksburg, which was about 15 minutes from her parents' house. There, she landscaped and gardened her little heart out for 4 years before deciding to go back to school to pursue a master's in botany. Once she made that decision, Jane got in her 1977 Datsun 2000 convertible and drove all the way to California by herself, looking for the perfect school. Jane was hoping to attend a school that would accept her in their program as a student and a teaching assistant ASAP. Audrey told interviewers, once she made up her mind to do something, she wanted to do it yesterday. After her cross-country trip to Cali, Jane landed on a school a bit closer to home, the University of Maryland. She then moved to Clarksburg, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and began her schooling with the ultimate goal of becoming an environmental lawyer. Due to the nature of her field, Jane spent a lot of time at Blackbird State Forest. The forest is about 15 miles north of Dover, Delaware, a very quiet and calm area where violent crimes were few and far between. In the 2 years leading up to Jane's attack, she had gone to the park numerous times. Unlike the other visitors of the park, Jane came without a weapon and wasn't into hunting or anything. Okay, so that leads me to believe someone saw her at the park regularly and decided it was the perfect setup to abduct her. I mean, think about it. It was in the woods, Jane was all alone, and maybe she came on a certain day of the week or month or something where her attacker could predict her visit that September. Gosh, I hate this theory though. Like, why does this smart, independent person have to be preyed on just because she's a woman out conducting research by herself? And that's just my theory, but it seems pretty legit. On the other hand, there were plenty of hunters and outdoors people who frequented the park, but I also don't know why anyone would want to attack Jane. And wouldn't she have caught on to someone stalking her? She seemed to be an intelligent and aware woman. Another theory posed by the web sleuths of Reddit is that this was a crime carried out by a park officer. That time of year was a busy time for park rangers and trail maintenance, so if anyone would know about Jane and her visits, it'd be an employee. But someone else commented on the Reddit thread saying Blackbird isn't part of the park system. Instead, it's run by the Department of Agriculture and doesn't have a big staff. I don't know, I feel like having a smaller staff might be beneficial to the attacker. Anyway, that is a theory from some random internet forum, and it's hard to prove or disprove at this point. But we do have a bit of information about the forest manager from back then. His name was John Bennett, and he said he knew Jane pretty well, although he didn't know much about these hog peanuts. John said Jane would come to Blackbird every few weeks to sit and study the plants all day. He said, there was something about that girl. She was very dedicated and enthusiastic about her work. If I'd let her, she'd have spent days telling me about her work. A part of me thinks this could be read as creepy, but it also seems like John truly did just respect Jane for her enthusiasm about and commitment to the outdoors. He also had worked in that position for somewhere around 17 years, so he seemed to be a nature lover himself. Well, those are the main 2 theories that I've found or come up with myself, but I'm sure there are many other possibilities out there. Who knows? The perp could have even been a student Jane taught at the university that didn't like her or something. So now it's time for you to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Jane was slain by a hunter out in the forest, one of the park rangers, or maybe even Michael, and the one strand of hair is just unrelated? Thanks for tuning in to hear about Jane Marie Prichard's story. We'll see you next time on Killer Bites!